my story, I suppose, begins in my childhood. I was brought up without any particular religious background. My entire family were agnostic towards the idea of God, and anything that followed that was kind of it. It probably doesn't exist, but it may do. We don't know. And as I was brought up through school, I very soon came to the belief that there's nothing really more than what there is that we can see. Consciousness is all in the brain. It's made by the brain. We know that because when you hit your head, you lose it. You can change the brain and change consciousness. And that was pretty obvious to me. And it was all the way through till year 8 in secondary school, which is probably high school, middle school for everyone in the States. When I was about 12, I experienced a traumatic event at school. And that triggered an anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and depression. The depression didn't begin until a few months after the anxiety began, until eventually it became worse and worse to the event where I ended up having some form of breakdown where I became suicidal. Now, the anxiety was focused mainly around the fear of death, because the idea and the knowledge at my point of view that at that point was once you die, that's it. The idea of never existing again for eternity was a terrifying thought. And that's what effectively saved my life from me taking my own life, because I was too frightened to know what would come next, or to not know what would come next as it happens. After I'd reached that low point, I discovered the near-death experience mainly through just a casual interest. I was wandering around online looking at something, and this experience popped up. I'd heard of them before, but I'd always dismissed them as a trick of dying mind, lack of oxygen to the brain, things like that. And there are a lot of theories that circulate in that regard. And I thought nothing of it until I started coming along a phenomena called veridical perception, which is something that really did open my eyes to the validity of the near-death experience. I've always said any near-death experience that is subjective only, I can very easily dismiss as some form of hallucination or trick of the mind. But when veridical perception is involved, i.e. seeing something that shouldn't have been seen and reporting it later to verification from others, that's when it starts to become a problem to believing what I did at that point about the mind and brain. Following that, I started doing all the research I could, mainly for my own interest because of the anxiety and the depression. Any sort of suggestive thing that suggested I may not die and lose everything, as I believed at that time, I found it very interesting and very helpful to look into. And subsequently, I've had the chance to speak with many of the world's leading experts in the subject, including Dr. Bruce Grayson and Dr. Jan Holden of IANDS itself, and have connected with several others associated with IANDS and outside who are very, very knowledgeable on the subject, much more knowledgeable than I ever realized one could be on a subject that I didn't believe in. And through that research, I now share my own journey and my own research through my podcast, as you can see behind me, Seeking I. Now, from that point, that's where I currently am. I'm now training as a cognitive behavioral therapist as a result of my anxiety and what I've learned through near-death experiences, which I plan to incorporate. And I'm just looking forward to seeing where the next few years goes.
So let me just throw out first the fact that all of you are students in some way. And you've all talked about, I'm a student of being the priesthood, nursing, computer. In other words, all of you have said something about studenthood and so on. Do you see presently, students that you're with, that there is any interest in any discussions that y'all have? I'm going to use nursing for an example. I mean, when we talk about resuscitating somebody, the possibility that they come back, hey, that happens, we hope. And then what about after they have come back, and then what about their recovery and etc.? So in nursing school, it makes perfect sense, because since I am a nurse, it makes perfect sense that we would talk about this. So certainly, Vince, you might be able to address that, but the rest of you, what are you seeing right now at all? We want to help people learn and grow and know, but what do you see right now amongst students that you're even involved with in your venue now? Any of you take that question and go with it?
Well, I generally, within the realms of psychology, I don't see much talk on the subject of near-death experiences, because psychology is a notorious science for trying to attribute everything to mental tricks. in terms of general students, I find that there's a lot more openness, especially in the philosophical circles, to other philosophies of life other than the default materialism, such as metaphysical idealism, um, dualism as well, of course, and panpsychism, which do posit some form of fundamental consciousness as opposed to fundamental material in which consciousness emerges. And certainly as I've done work online and just casually looked around online, there is a lot of upcoming support for that kind of philosophy, which seems to be challenging the current scientific paradigms.
So one of our other objectives was to talk about barriers. So can each one of you say a little bit about what you've seen? That can certainly be personal and or professional, school, youth, etc. What barriers have you seen so far that kind of stood in the way of people understanding, accepting, even recognizing near-death experiences? What kind of barriers have you seen in your own walk? Darren, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll go first. This is
Okay.
what I mainly talk about in my podcast and in my project altogether is this kind of thing. The biggest barrier I've seen is biases, cognitive biases amongst people who claim to not have them, which as soon as anybody tells you that, it's a red flag because everybody does. But the biggest cognitive bias is seen, from my point of view, all the way through the education system because we're taught under a very strict realm, especially in science, under a very strict realm of what is true and what is not. And it's based on the current scientific understandings we have as being correct. And that the certain scientific methods that we use to measure and discover things is the only way it's done. And people very often misunderstand science to be materialism. Whereas materialism is a philosophy that stems from science, the human endeavor to understand the world and the universe. There's so much phenomena out there now, including the near-death experience as well as others, that question the current understanding of science. And yet it seems to not be a part of the education system to even suggest that these things may have validity. I went through school 8, 10, even longer than that, 7 years primary school, 7 years, so 14, 15 years of school, 15 years of science. Never once did we hear about near-death experiences and what may or may not cause them, despite even back then them being quite well known at that point. And for the younger generation especially, it's difficult with the age of the internet and the age of social media. I've gone online several times looking for debates between good people who know what they're talking about in this subject. Is there life after death? Are NDEs evidence of life after death? Are they not? Usually what you find is the ones with the most views, the videos with the most views, and therefore that suggests that the videos that most people are seeing are of those made for entertainment, not for education purposes, those that shout at each other and those that insult each other. And in reality, the two participants are both very much biased in their own view, and they believe themselves to be correct. And my aim is not to try and learn from this other position. My aim is to shout them down and show them that I'm right. And the way that social media works is that when you see something like that that supports your position, the system of cookies will find what you're last looking at and will give you other content to look at which is similar to what you already looked at. So you're effectively living in an echo chamber of self-validation. Very few people that I've been aware of are what I would consider open-minded to the possibility that they may be completely wrong and that this other view may be completely right. And I think, or not completely right, but at least might be of value. And I think the reason for that is we're never taught in education. It seems the main point of mainstream education is to teach you how to become useful in society and how to make money. And studying near-death experiences, it goes so far against the mainstream view of what constitutes real and not real that it's not something that's encouraged upon you to learn about, which is why folks like Dr. Bruce Grayson and Dr. Jeffrey Long, who Vince mentioned, they didn't get into this professionally. They founded their research through their own experiences or through a genuine interest in it, not academic. In fact, I believe some of these people were strongly urged against doing it because you can't make a career of it. So I think the biggest barrier, especially in the education system, is that we're taught what is useful information, but we're not taught how to question the information we're being taught and how to consider our own experiences, our own opinions, and come up with our own ideas to support them, and how to do that in a reasonable situation. But more importantly, we're not taught how to be humble to the fact that we don't understand nearly so much as we think we do. I was going to say, I think it's somewhere around, and I'm probably pulling this number out of nothing, but I've definitely seen it somewhere, 0.05% of the universe is observable within that very thin band of radiation or whatever it is, that is observable by human beings. And so that means 99.95% of the universe is effectively invisible, immeasurable, unimaginable. So to me, to be taught in school and to be constantly reminded online and elsewhere that we understand things for certain the way they definitely work seems ludicrous to me, statistically at least.
Diane, go ahead.
Just a couple of comments. One of the things that I've found that is really wonderful for kids are Walden schools, because the Walden schools have different philosophies. And for example, every year they have a theme for the year. And I think it's the 5-year-old or 6-year-old, they start out and the whole theme is about fairies. And they go in the woods, they look for them, they build fairy houses. I mean, every year they're taught to think out of the box. And this is a wonderful thing. And they have the same teachers for all through the years. I think it's a lovely school system because it's really for kids who don't think like other ones. One of the other things is YouTube, Lee Whitting's NDE radio has over 400 NDEs that you can listen to and talk to. And those are things that are really reassuring and to be shared. To spend your time trying to argue with other people and get them down is really a waste of your energy, because you believe what you believe, they're going to believe, and just Debbie and I have been doing this for 1,000 years, and nurses are very receptive to this information, OTs, PTs, psychologists usually. Doctors, not so much, some of the other scientists. But last year I did a talk in London with physicists. The person before me who talked was a physicist. And he went on and on about how there's this little thing in the brain and what it does, and it creates an NDE. And I'm sitting there and, very interesting. Pim van Lommel was in the audience, and his wife. And then I got up and gave a very down-to-earth thing about NDEs in combat, what the characteristics were, after effects, etc. And I went up to Pim's wife and I said, "How did you like the talk from the physicist?" She said, "I have no idea what he said. I didn't understand a word he said." So, just common sense, talking it out, giving examples goes a long way than trying to debate the scientific level.
Do you mind if I just quickly add something there?
Sure.
I would say yes, it's not very useful to argue with people who are simply out there to confirm their own God forbid they were wrong about anything, but to confirm their own biases. However, I believe strongly, and I've tried to facilitate it on Seeking Eye, that debate with informed people, informed and open people, who are at least very aware of the literature and maybe come to a different conclusion. Discussions around that area, not the sort of debates you see online, which aren't debates, they're boxing matches, but proper civilized discussions between two experts who disagree, I think is very helpful,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
that is science. That is,
Yeah.
well, I wouldn't even say that's science. That's interpreting information that's received from
That's
science in
learning.
different ways.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
learning.
Many people think culture is race creed. I mean, that's it. No, 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 no. What about age? What about, let's just say that it could be something about spirituality, religion, et cetera, et cetera. Certainly education. Literally, it could be gender. You know how some people say all men over 50, well, what? It's that man and those people and et cetera, et cetera. But when you look at cultural decision making and cultural influence, yeah, age, you just mentioned several things as all of you were describing. Age could be a big deal. And that's what we're talking about right now, is the young, the youth. So in terms of culture, that is a cultural issue, as well as other things we're talking about right now, literally being about spirituality. And what about spiritually transformative experiences that people experience? We have near-death experiences, but there's also other, as I just said, spiritually transformative experiences. So wow, have we hit a lot? So I'm going to ask y'all right this minute, since at the end of this, you know, I'm going to say something about, hey guys, what are we going to do? How are we going to help? Our very last thing is, what can IANDS do? What strategies do we have? I'm going to say one of the things we should think about is looking at all these barriers we just identified. They're beautiful. Exactly what you said. Each and every one of you said one thing or more about barriers that, wow, if IANDS could focus on that in our education committee, or looking at where we go from here to there in conferences, et cetera, wow, that's huge. So would you agree with me that we should take a look at those barriers in the future? How's that sound? Yeah.
I think it's a good idea. I think you'll have
Absolutely.
a big challenge on your hands,
Mhm.
especially to reach the young,
Mhm.
because the young are brought up learning from the people around them, and in our culture, they're brought up with one of two possibilities usually, and that is, in terms of death, for example, there's nothing after death. That's it. You're gone. You die, or you go to heaven. You've got a staunch materialistic scientific point of view, or you've got a staunch religious point of view. And from a very young age, when you're subject to one or both of those, depending on who your parents are, which school you go to, you're going to be growing up with that idea in place, and it's going to require some kind of deconditioning to manage it. Now, when we're young, death isn't a big issue because we feel immortal. We feel like we're never going to die. That's a long time in the future. And I often find that those interested in near-death phenomena are either of the older generation, where they're reaching the age where it's becoming a more prevalent issue that they will die at some point, and it's coming into their consciousness, or they're people who, like me, who's gone very blurry on Zoom, but never mind, like me, who have had a traumatic experience, which has brought them to a humility that this is temporary. I know now that I'm not going to be here forever, and in my opinion, it's a shame, because what happens after death is, to me, perhaps the most important fundamental question humanity could ask, because it's inevitable for 100% of us. And I think it's a shame that it's not focused on more. But for people our age, unless there is something that pushes you off the straight and narrow path of life and pushes you aside to really push the idea of death into your consciousness, it takes, unfortunately, usually a very suffering episode or a very traumatic episode, usually the death of a person that you love, or like me, a traumatic event. And I think breaking through the conditioning of many young people is going to be a challenge, but is a very vital path forward in human evolution of understanding, I think.
Most young people, if I would say, let's take your average American city, if you're in college, your average American city, right, or high school, you're out drinking with your friends, you're out partying with your friends, having a good time. You're thinking about boyfriends and girlfriends, and you're thinking about your classes, and this, for a lot of younger people, this isn't even on their radar at all. So I think that that's a big part of it too. And, for me, it's been different. I've carried this in my heart through all of those years. So it's different, I think, for a lot of other younger people. So, yeah.
Mhm.
Can I
Yeah.
quickly just add on to that? Because I think you added a very important point there, Vince. When you said that people of Gen Y and Z have the innate fear of death, and they don't have answers to the questions, I think you're right. But I think that the more vital thing was what you said at the last. It never enters their radar. They never have had anything to make them consider the questions and to ask. They're never encouraged to ask the questions, to look at these sort of things, because it's assumed it's already understood or we'll never know. So they don't have that encouragement to go and search for themselves. I think that's a key point about that is a key barrier. Is just
that goes back, Darren. That goes back to what you said about the focus of culture in general. Is it's very about this world. It's very about getting a job and making a living and getting a house, and obviously those things are important. It's just those are the main focus, I think. And for young people, that's really what's on their mind, at least in my experience, unless something like this up.
Mm-hmm. And then I think the problem is by the time they've reached the point where they begin to consider it, it's too late. They're too close to that point now to really get involved and learn with it. And that usually will result in uncertainty and fear. If you learn about this stuff earlier, throughout your life, at least then you can be prepared that when the time comes, you have some idea, not certainty. Certainly, I mean, the amount of time I've been doing this kind of research for, I'm not certain that there's life after death. I can't be, and I try not to be, because as soon as you could become certain of something, you don't look at any other possibility. But if you have some kind of idea of where you're going, you can approach that area or that event with much less fear and much more curiosity, I suppose.
It's important that we remember, Debbie and I can speak to this, difficult for you. We have been doing this a long, long time. And like the invention of penicillin, it took over 50 years from the time penicillin was invented to people starting to use it, to understand it, to trust it. Well, we're right in that window now, the 50-year window. When I started lecturing, there's not one book, not one movie, not one anything. And the first talk I did, I took an experiencer with me. Only time I ever did that. So we're in the perfect window. We're starting to see the light. So we have to not be too pessimistic about it, because this is sort of the natural order of things. And now we have thousands of books and movies and speakers, and I think we're gonna break through some things, and we just have to keep all the aspects going that you're talking about, social media, and really have to spread this out to young people, nursing students and psychology students, and students interested will be the key.
Mm-hmm. What about those little people that have near-death experiences? What about the person who literally has it whenever they're little, like we talked about earlier, the baby and the mother, etc. There are lots of children who have near-death experiences. And Diane will tell you, many years we've looked at conferences and said, ooh, how about if we have little people, little children, be on a panel and talk about their near-death experience. So you know what happened with that. PMH, many of us have tried to do it, to put that all together, but because of privacy, because of the issues with children and exposure and so on, we haven't been able to do that. So at the IANDS level, putting this together in terms of recognizing, learning, hearing those little people. And I'm sure many of you have read books that were put together. It was supposedly written by the child. The child can't even write, but yeah, the child's information went into a story, a book, etc., appropriately. So there's people out there trying to do this, but what do y'all think right now is happening in our world to children who have near-death experiences and they want to tell it? Because you know, when kids talk to each other, if you're 3 or 4 years old and you talk to each other, you don't even need to finish the sentence. You just talk to each other and you're fine with that. And it doesn't matter what language, they're just fine talking to each other because they're so pure and so on. But what about the 15-year-old or the 8-year-old that had the near-death experience? How do y'all see that now from your eyes as young? How do you see that these little people would be received or are being received at this point?
They also speak to their spirit beings
Mhm.
because at very young ages, kids connect with the spirit world very easily. And
Mhm.
Deb, I have a couple of questions when you get done there.
Okay. Go ahead,
I,
guys.
th- I think you can learn a lot more from a child's near-death experience or a child's experience with anything in particular, more than you can from any adult, because they don't have the years of conditioning, as I was talking about previously, to paint on top of it. I mean, one of the most common retorts I hear or arguments against the near-death experience that I've come across is that, well, every experience is tailored to the person. Christians will see Jesus, Hindus will see one of the Hindu gods, etc. So clearly it's all in the mind. Well, with children, and we don't deny that that is the case, but with children, there's no, that conditioning isn't there, nor is the fear of death to kind of imagine what is to come next and therefore imagine the experience when it happens. So with children, you can get a much more raw, fundamental experience, which, funnily enough, always seem to contain the same fundamentals as any other near-death experience. Whereas children will see, white light people or whatever, whereas someone who's older, maybe grew up in a Christian family, would say they saw Jesus. As to how it'd be received, it'd be a very delicate thing, because obviously the younger you are, the more malleable your brain is and the more suggestible you are. So it'd have to be approached very carefully, the way that you should sufficiently and appropriately respond to that child. And certainly I'd say don't ship them off straight away to a psychologist or a psychiatrist telling them that they're going mad or they're experiencing schizophrenic episodes, because I mean, I wonder a lot of the time if a lot of imaginary friends that children have are perhaps some spiritual experience or some spiritual entity helping them by. The parents, I'd say, should not dismiss the experiences all in the imagination without first understanding the phenomena. And if the child does experience something like that, talk not necessarily to a psychiatrist, but talk to somebody who has looked at these things, like PMH or any other IANDS researcher. The problem is, I think, because IANDS generally and the phenomena itself is little known in mainstream in the mainstream population, that people will rush them off straight away to the professionals that they're told to, the psychologists and whatever else. So it's shifting a world view to incorporate these, whether it be in the adults or in the children. It's shifting that worldview to make these valid experiences and real experiences. So, yeah.
When you mention the parents too, I can tell you how people have been surprised when I've told them, when the child starts talking about this thing that happened to them, I told parents, give your child a piece of paper and colors. And they said, oh, for heaven's sakes. And I said, it's going to look like a bunch of colors on a piece of paper. That's all it's going to look like. But if you ask the child to tell you about the picture, they'll tell you about their near-death experience. And one mom couldn't believe all that yellow right there was such and such. And then there was another being in that big clump of blue over there. So I think you're absolutely right. The way we respond as parents, as healthcare practitioners, as people, wow, that's huge. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think if you jump straight in and say, it's all right, Tony, whatever, this didn't happen, this was in your head, or okay, but not take it seriously, that child's going to grow up believing that it was all in his head and that maybe there was something wrong with him, or it will certainly learn, I shouldn't talk about this because I'll be told it's just in my imagination, and therefore you've missed an opportunity to really study an important phenomena, and a pure one as well from a child's mind.
And we're starting to run, excuse me, close to our time limit. And so I'm going to ask you, I'll just throw this out because we know the International Association for Near-Death Studies, you've been talking about IANDS so much, but we are about studies too. And so somewhere in the closing remarks of this, we're not closing yet, but could each one of you say something about our third goal was to look at the outcomes we might have in terms of future research with IANDS? So in other words, if we could get the youth educated, aware, knowledgeable about near-death experiences, what might that do to future NDE research?
I think if IANDS was to look in the future of really getting to the younger generations of future scientists and future philosophers and future carers, the most efficient way to do that would be to introduce a school course, a 101 course on the phenomena as a genuine phenomena, not some imaginary thing in a religious class, for instance. Not that I'm saying all religion is imaginary, but that's where this sort of thing would usually be. I'd put it more as an offset of the science class, because I mean a lot of people, and I know a lot of people that I grew up with, would see kind of the religion class as something secondary, whereas science is a primary thing. I'd put it as an offset of science and talk about it in maybe a psychology offset, but have a 101 course on the near-death experience and focus mainly, and this I suppose addresses Katie's question earlier as well about is it important to bring up both the after effects as well as the empirical. I'd say with that, it depends who you're talking to, who you're trying to convince. I think with those in a school setting who are academically focused, you need to first put this as a genuine phenomena by showing the empirical nature of it, the veridical perception and various other phenomena that have been verified as a genuine phenomena. Because if you focus mainly on the after effects and how it's helped people's lives, that would still be, I think, interpreted as, I suppose, a bit of a myth or a bit of a nice story, a bit of an anecdote. But when you employ validation, veridical perception in it, now you have empiricism and now you have a genuine phenomenon. So I think that would be a good way for IANDS to go forward, would be to create a 101 class, introduce it to a few schools and try to bring that more into the mainstream education system.
Very nice. And that goes back into that mentorship thing that we were talking about as well. So, guys, I told you I was going to ask you this before we closed, and that is, what are we going to set in pace for next year? Because y'all know as well as I do, we are going to come back to the next year's conference, to the 2022 conference, and do some big smash because of what we've done this year. You've also said we're going to look at the barriers. We're going to tell the board to look at the barriers that we've faced. Also, every one of you have said something about social media and using the tools, and you've said beautiful ways of looking at social media. And I think it was Darren who said or got us started on the new normal. What is the new normal going to look like if we're using that and trying to help people in different ways to learn? And the radar, y'all talked about that, how we're kind of off on the radar, the tools we just said, and research, looking at a 101 and having some things in different levels of class, school, etc. How can we take it forward in whatever it might be? Some of you said science and religion. It could be nursing, medicine. It could be the housewife. How do we get it into different kinds of strategies people are using to be a home caregiver of mom and dad who have dementia, etc.? I mean, there's all kinds of avenues we could tap into. So guys, what have I not said that you all would like to say in closing?
I think we've pretty much covered everything we can. I'll just say the last thing is, again, I'd emphasize the importance of really prioritizing getting out the information about the empiricism of near-death experiences, because once you can inject it into the mainstream scientific community, and they won't be interested in really the after effects of it all, because they know that any imaginary event can also cause some sort of trauma, positive or negative. But if you can get the empiricism out into the mainstream to look at, that's when it will be incorporated and taken more seriously. And once it's in the mainstream science, then it becomes into the mainstream media, and then it branches out into the schools as an actual science, gets on at the syllabus, and then you've got the way in. And the reason I say probably best to do it as a science class rather than a religious one, although I understand that the value of that, is that these experiences are not dependent on one's religion. The interpretation of them maybe are, but they occur no matter what religion you are, no matter what background culture you are, they always occur, and they occur with very similar underpinnings. So to me, it's more a scientific question than a religious one, because it's human wide, it's and possibly species wise, we don't know.